Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, you followed this debate this afternoon. Keir Starmer, well, he's not Tony Blair. I mean, Tony Blair was flattening the Conservatives in the 1990s on sleaze. But not a bad day for him.
Yeah, certainly making an impact, and given, where, as you say, Keir Starmer necessarily hasn't had the impact in the past, I think today in Parliament he certainly did to a degree. We just saw the clip there, didn't we, during the news, where he talked about how the Conservatives were given a green light to corruption, and that the government wants to weaken the system by kind of changing the rules. That's the main allegation, of course, from the Labour Party. Will his kind of Tory sleaze, will it stick? Well, that's going to be a question that's going to play out in politics, isn't it, in the weeks and months to come. But I do think this is resonating to a degree. We're always starting to see a slight shift in the polls. We know that MPs have been written to by constituents about this. And we also know, of course, lots of Conservative MPs last week were not terribly happy about having to walk through that lobby on behalf of the government when they really didn't want to, when they knew, having read that report, which maybe some in Downing Street did not, that Owen Paterson essentially did do wrong and had been found to do wrong. Now, this debate, 3 hours long, it's just wrapped up actually in the last couple of minutes in the Commons. I think a few interesting things. First of all, we also heard from Alberto Costa. Now, he's a Conservative MP, and he was in many ways trying to make the argument for why the system needs to change. Aside from the Owen Paterson case, this is in terms of when an MP is investigated and found guilty, there is no appeals process. And this was, I suppose, the argument that Owen Paterson did have some
which is a reasonable and fair argument for any form of justice.
Indeed, and he also points out that on that committee there are 14 people, 7 lay people, 7 MPs, but none of them got any judicial experience. And in many ways, of course, it is a job being an MP, but there is more to it than that, and they're saying there's not the expertise to properly investigate these cases. Also interestingly, we did hear from Stephen Barclay. Now, Stephen Barclay went further than the Prime Minister did today in that hospital in Hexham in Northumberland, in which he did apologise for what went on last week. He was sat, interestingly, next to Jacob Rees-Mogg and to Mark Spencer. Mark Spencer's the Chief Whip, who looked pretty glum, it must be said, during all of this. They're seen as some of the key characters who were pushing the Paterson agenda within Number 10. Also very interestingly, of course, the Prime Minister himself wasn't there, which I think some Conservative MPs were pretty angry with. They thought,
no previous engagement.
Well, he should bring this. Well, previous engagement. This is the Prime Minister, of course, who got a private jet back from from Glasgow to London last week, didn't he, to go for dinner? It is possible to get from Northumberland back to London if you really want to. I think putting Stephen Barclay up, though, as the kind of government spokesperson was an attempt to try and kill this as a story as much as possible. One other thing, and it's a different story, but it's part of the same story, because this story, as with many stories, has started to grow tentacles in different directions. Nigel, there was a report in the Sunday Times yesterday about kind of cash for access, or cash for honours, I should say, when it comes to the House of Lords. This idea that I think 15 of the last 16 Conservative treasurers have somehow ended up with a peerage. Each of them seem to have donated around more than £3 million each.
I thought you could buy honours much more cheaply than that.
Well, so this is the allegation, and the SNP, perhaps unsurprisingly, have now taken this to the police. Now, we don't know how far this is going to go, but they're asking for the police to investigate this. And Pete Wishart, who's an SNP spokesperson, was making that point in the Commons today.
So, what I've done today, Mr. Speaker, I've asked the Metropolitan Police to investigate these appointments under the provisions of Section 1, Subsection 2 of the Honours Prevention of Abuses Act 1925. That Act states, if any person gives or agrees or proposes to give or offers to any person any gift, money or valuable consideration as an inducement or reward for procuring or assisting or endeavouring to procure the grant of a dignity or title of honour to any person or otherwise in connection with such a grant shall be guilty of a misdemeanour. I have now asked the Metropolitan Police to investigate the activities of the Conservative Party and the awarding of places in the House of Lords.
So there you go, that's Pete Wishart speaking. And I think what's interesting about this is again, we're hearing the same arguments. We hear this. It comes around like a carousel about House of Lords and who gets into it.
Labour had just as much trouble.
It is. And most say corruption is not confined, or alleged corruption is not confined to the Conservative Party. And also we must say that, there is no sign that these individuals have actually done anything wrong. But it raises those questions again about the House of Lords and how people end up in it. Coming back to the second jobs front, or what's happened after this kind of emergency Commons motion, there was no debate on it. It's not having practical impact. What is going to follow next is that the Commons Standards Committee, which is headed by Chris Bryant, a Labour MP, is looking into how the rules might change. We know that Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, wants things to change. He thinks this has damaged Parliament quite a lot. And there is the argument from the Labour Party where they essentially want to end this idea of a second job for MPs, potentially in a trade-off for trying to help change the process that MPs could appeal against decisions if they're ruled not in favour of them. So we'll have to see what plays out there. Meanwhile, of course, the opposition will continue to try and make as much political capital as they can.
Well, I mean, MPs do have outside income, and remarkably, folks, Theresa May, the Conservative Member of Parliament from Maidenhead, she, in the last year, has earned £842,526 giving speeches. Interesting. My friend Donald Trump said he'd pay not to hear her speak. But
and she's not alone. I mean, Andrew Mitchell, £182,000 on top of his salary. Another Julian Smith, who's another Conservative, £144,000. The Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey, earned £60,000 as a consultant. And, there are a lot of MPs earning a lot of money outside of just being an MP. The question of Owen Paterson was, of course, that is not wrong. It's not against the rules. It's about using that.
Did Paterson lobby? That was the question.
Which he was found guilty essentially of.
But it's now clearly broadened out. This is a much bigger debate. As you say, this is about should they have any second work. And the public can't stand this. And yet, I was elected in 1999 to the European Parliament. Right? I was running my own company. I had 6 members of staff. What was I supposed to do? Fire them all? I mean, what if you're a practicing doctor? There are people who have lives before politics, and lives are... And if not, all we finish up with is a bunch of rich kids. Yeah. And we had plenty of those in the early 2010s. People who've never needed to work, never had proper jobs. So I don't know, Darren, isn't perhaps the argument, should you, as an MP, strike a new relationship with a new commercial company? Maybe there's an argument there, I don't know. Yeah,
it's difficult, and in many ways what we've always claimed about politics is that we want people who have actually got outside interests because because it makes them more relevant. What you don't want, and this argument's slightly gone away, but it's not gone away in terms of the makeup of MPs who literally go from either being special advisors in government, party political at university, and then just get elected with no life experience outside. And add to that, you're right, if MPs... And, frankly, and this is an argument the public don't like, but frankly, MPs aren't paid an enormous wage, comparable to other countries, or indeed potentially other jobs they could do. And you're right, you may well end up, actually, with lots of wealthy people who can afford not to work to get into politics. Labour's argument, though, on second jobs is, and they wouldn't extend it to people who are GPs or whatever, it's mainly the consulting stuff and those outside interests. Their job is... you can declare all of this, you can play within the rules, but as Owen Paterson shows, there's still a line that could be crossed, and the easiest way to prevent that is just not to have these second jobs, and that ultimately MPs should just be focused on their main job, which is being a member of Parliament, which is pretty full-time. But would that come, or should it come with, in tandem to them earning substantially more money, which would compensate? Maybe it would, but the public... all the people out there, frankly, don't like that either.
Well, but the public don't want MPs to have bigger salaries and don't want them to have outside interests, and somehow that's got to change. I've always made the point that the local GP earns more than the constituency MP. The local headmistress earns more.
Local council leaders or heads of quangos earn more than the Prime Minister.
In fact, in most local councils, there'll be half a dozen people earning more than the MP. This one will run and run.
Yeah, I think so. It's really interesting, just finally on this, about how much damage it is doing to the government. They've clearly been rattled. There's been big questions about Downing Street's political intent now. So there's 2 arguments here. First of all, the public, and I think we've seen a slight change in the polls. I suspect it will I wouldn't be surprised if Labour took at least a temporary lead, and we've got by-elections coming up, which could be a real political barometer on all of that. Is it a game changer? I'm not entirely sure it is at the moment. I don't think it's going to kind of, I don't think Labour's going to take a substantial long-term lead on this issue, but it depends how much they hammer it and what more is to come. But also, I think, in some ways, even more concerning from Downing Street is the impact it's had on those backbench Conservative MPs who've had to, time and time again, walk through that lobby, time and time again, gone on TV to defend a policy or an announcement or a decision by the government, and then 24 hours later they've got custard pie on their face, or in some ways worse.
Yeah, they're going to...
At some point, those MPs are going to think, well, I'm not prepared to do this again, because they're also, frankly, getting an awful lot of stick from their constituents for doing this. And I think that breakdown, potentially, in relations between Number 10 and its backbenchers, that could be the most crucial impact
we could see more
of what's
that.
played out.
Yeah.